All right, hello everyone. My name is Amir, and I work here at Capital One as a software engineer, and I'm going to be talking to you guys today about composition over configuration. Now, what is this talk really about? And let's see my slides from here. So basically, the talk does apply to React, but it's not really exclusive. In fact, it's not even exclusive to JavaScript per se. And it's really more to do with concepts than specific tech. And what I kind of hope that people take away by the end of the talk is specific concepts I'm going to be discussing. And I think that's actually a lot more important than the tech that you'll see. And it's to do with scalability, reusability, and sustainability. So, as our teams grow, as our products grow, our companies grow, it becomes more and more difficult to make apps that kind of last over a long time. And I think following some of these principles could potentially help us. It's also not a really new concept per se. It's been around for a while. Unfortunately, it's somewhat underutilized, and I think it might be because it requires a bit of a shift in your mindset and how you think about building applications with React. So with that, let's just look at what I mean by configuration. Essentially what I mean is when you use a component with excessive props, and what are props really? They're just options. So you're just providing more and more options to the same component to get more functionality out of it. And it's kind of an easy trap to fall into. I know I've fallen into it myself. And I think, it's one of those things that sort of like you start with a little extra option, you're like, oh, I'll just add this one. And then before you know it, there are way too many options and you don't know what your component is doing anymore. So to sort of understand it a little bit better, I figured we can kind of look at some kind of concrete examples. These screenshots are specifically from one of our products. It's basically the portal that our customers use to access their credit card and manage it. So as you can see at the bottom, we have some expandables, and they have some specific look. There's a chevron that's kind of hugging the actual text. The text has a specific look. Then we go to another part of the app. There's another expandable, and this one looks completely different. The chevron is all the way to the right, and everything about Expandable basically looks different. Again, another one within the same app. Another one. This one doesn't even have a chevron. It has a plus that turns into a cross when you open it. This one, the Expandable is being used inside an accordion, and obviously it depends on how the accordion's logic is meant to work, but a lot of accordions, when you click on one of them, the other ones close automatically. And you could also have nested ones, and basically this can just get away from you as you get more and more of them. But you sort of want to reuse, at the same time you don't want to end up with a component that does too many things. And this is just one app. So we have a component library that different apps across the company use. So we have to deal with all these components across all these different apps and somehow keep it sane, basically. And this is essentially what sort of you end up with when you go down the route of configuration. I call it configuration hell. It's basically every time you think of a new feature, you add a prop, you're like, oh, I wanted to do this, okay, we had a configure. I'm not going to go through all these ones, but you kind of get the idea. So with that in mind, basically, what is composition then? Composition is really about building more complex functionality, more complex components out of simpler ones. And in a sense, even the complex components should be simple, because it shouldn't really know what's happening inside of the components that it's made out of. And none of those sibling components should really know about each other. They should sort of know about their interface, how they interface with one another, but they shouldn't really know anything about how they actually function underneath. And that's sort of, in a nutshell, that's what composition is. But obviously I'm going to dive in and go into more detail. So going back into the expandable example, I should sort of preface by saying obviously this code is pseudocode. It's really meant to give more concepts than actual tech. So So if you kind of think of expandable, what is really an expandable or collapsible, however you want to call it? If you sort of like strip it down to its bone, what is it? It's basically a wrapper that just expands and closes. Like that's literally it. So if you kind of think of it that way, and we think of it as something that we can sort of reuse in different parts of our application, the basics of it is we want to measure the height of the children, and then we want to sort of animate that height. As I said, this is pseudocode. That measure height, for instance, could be a React hook, it could be a HOC, or it could be render prop, whatever. That doesn't really matter. The point is that this component is just going to do one thing, and that one thing really well. It's not going to do anything other than that. And then we were like, well, all those screenshots that you saw, all the expandables had a head. So at this point, I'm going to add the head in, because this is sort of what I need, because they all sort of have that. Or at least I think they all have that. And then after that comes sort of the trigger, how we have the trigger to actually, when you click that head, it actually opens and closes the expandable. Now you might say, why have you separated these two? Why do you have the head on its own and then you've added the button later? If you're going to go back to that configuration hell example, there was one of the props that said disable head trigger, because sometimes we want to be able to control our expandable from the outside by other means. We don't want it to be based on somebody clicking it. And so I don't need it to be triggerable by the head. So instead of me creating another prop, another option just to do that, I'm going to basically branch off my component tree and sort of not bother with adding a button and then disabling that button. I just want to add that button, essentially. And yeah, so we're going to continue now. When we think of composition, I think it's really important to think beyond just the UI and what you see on the page. It's sometimes also about how you actually put these things together, how they fit into each other. So in React, obviously, we have the concept of controlled versus uncontrolled. In case you guys aren't familiar with it, uncontrolled is basically when a component has its own internal state and it doesn't need state basically passed to it. And controlled is, the opposite. So for an expandable, uncontrolled is an expandable you can just drop in there and it will work, versus control, where you actually have to tell it when it's expanded and it's not expanded and give it a handler. Now what I've found best with when we've done building these components is to, unless there are certain circumstances that you sort of need the state to be internal to it because there's no point in exposing that state, that state always remains in there anyway. But other times when the state can be both passed in and not passed in, the easiest way to outcome process is to just make the component dumb, as you make it a control component, so that requires the state all the time. But then use a utility. It could be, again, a React hook, hardening component, whatever you want it to be. In this case, it's a hardening component. And then actually sort of add that layer of uncontrolled to it, add that internal state to it. And again, this now can be used for many different components. So not just for this, not just for Expandable, for many different things. And as you think of this tree that you're building, this hardening component comes at like various different levels. It doesn't have to be at one level. In fact, I'd say don't look at it as a tree, look at it more like a graph, more like a network. Because these branches can kind of go sideways. It doesn't have to be always, bottom up or top down. Hopefully that makes sense. And yeah, so we come across the whole item thing, and we had a chevron in there in the head. For the other one, we had a cross, so we can add a cross. But then you might say, okay, why don't we just have an icon prop for this? And to be honest, there's nothing wrong with that. I think the point I'm trying to make is that there's a hard and fast rule. It's more of a judgment call for when you add a prop and when you don't add a prop and you actually build a new component to add smaller bits. And it's that's something that comes down to, I think, you and your team, and you can kind of have a discussion about it, see what works better in this scenario, and go based on that. Overall, I would recommend as few props as possible, and make sure some of your components deal with as few concerns as possible because it's easier to deal with it that way, it's easier to test it, it's easier to scale it. Yeah, sometimes, when a component that we think of, sometimes you have to sort of almost turn it into different components for it to work in a different context. So in terms of the accordion, if you're doing the whole config thing, you might have to have a config where we tell the expandable that, hey, you're being used inside of an accordion, act in this different way. But that's, you're basically adding a whole other concern. So instead of that, we could use, we could wrap it again, and this time sort of change its interface, change how it sort of interacts with the outside world. So in this instance, for instance, in this example, I'm using a custom hook to kind of use the context that, say, the accordion exposes, and just provide the expandable with the necessary state and the handler. And essentially, in terms of this use case, it would sort of look something like this, where the accordion item is meant to be used only inside of an accordion, but it's not duplicating the functionality of an expandable, it's just using it internally. But it won't be able, you can't use this now outside of the accordion. If you want to do that, then you're just going to go and use the expandable. Now, just one more screenshots, just to sort of reiterate the point about how these components are built and how they kind of fit into each other. Now, this is a drop-down for the account section, and you might look at it and be like, well, this is a completely different component. It's a drop-down, it's something expandable, but it kind of is because that box there at the bottom actually does expand. But it's also kind of not because the head bit is not full width, and also that overlays, so it's actually absolutely positioned. So it's a bit different, but it's a bit similar. And this is where when we broke down sort of the functionality and how we built it back up, that's when, for things like this particularly, but in general, it comes in really handy. Because then we can be like, well, we're going to go to the step when there was no head at all on our expandable. We're going to use that expandable here because we don't need that head there. This is again an example. We can have our button there, and then add a wrapper that does the absolute positioning, and add a utility that handles clicks on the outside, because obviously we want to close the dropdown if you click anywhere else on the page. But underneath, you're still using expandable. We're not duplicating functionality. But we're also keeping things simple. So this component itself, even though it's doing a much more complex sort of piece of functionality in UI, when you say, if you do snapshot testing, for instance, if you do shallow render, this would look pretty simple. It's not doing a whole lot because the main concerns are handled in various different components. This thing is just putting them together. Just I always say, just like Lego, essentially, just treating your components like Lego blocks and just building them that way. So essentially, if you just want to sort of break down the principles of composition, what it really comes down to, and the whole shift in mindset that I sort of mentioned, small components. So really, that's, I would say, one of the most important rules, if not the most important one. Keep your components small. Obviously, that's not I'm not saying how many lines, I'm not going into that much detail, that's sort of up to you. But try and make it deal with only one concern, max two. If you're getting to 3 concerns, then it's probably time to break that component to a smaller component. As I said, have a component that does just one thing, and one thing really well, but that's just that one thing. And sort of think in more abstract terms. So when you get a design and you look at the design, or wireframe, whatever it is that you look at, don't look at it as a designer would. Don't just see the components that they would see. See it as as an engineer would. So as an example, what's the difference between a select and a radio button group? They both let you select one item out of the group. What's the difference between a checkbox group and a multi-select? They both allow you to select multiple items out of a group. Again, what's the difference between a switch and a single checkbox? They both allow you to do a binary choice between, say, true and false, or 0 and 1. So it's just thinking about these things in abstract terms will let us sort of break them into little pieces and use those little pieces to build something much more powerful. Another one, separation of concerns, and this really feeds back into the whole small component thing, because if you, from the beginning, separate the UI from the sort of functionality of the component, and even within the UI and within the functionality, separate the concerns right from the beginning, then you would end up with small components anyway. And in the beginning, it might be sort of like, oh, this is too much work, but then if you sort of get into the habit of doing it from the beginning, you sort of get used to it, and it's actually quite easier, and then going back is actually harder. Minimize configuration. So you can't get rid of configuration. In a sense, composition is built on minimal configuration anyway. It's just about then, minimal is essentially the key word here. Keep it to a minimum. Yeah, so again, few concerns. Don't make it too complicated. Build for reuse. So what I mean by that one is not to build something that is, all singing and dancing, and it does everything, every possible scenario that you think of. One, that's impossible. Two, that's actually going to get you into configuration hell anyway. What I mean is that if you can make your component sort of agnostic of where it's going to be used, so for instance, as much as possible, there are some exceptions, but as much as possible, if you can make it agnostic of where the page is going to go, or agnostic of how many of it is going to be in a page, then that component is much more useful for composition. So if a component that, I don't know, hooks into a very specific place in Redux, that's kind of a useless component when it comes to composition. Or a component that if you add two of it to a page, the whole page breaks, that's, again, useless. Obviously, exceptions here, some top-level components are sort of like that, but overall, for most components, this is not what you want. You want it to be reusable. And build it for easy consumption. So, when you're building a component, especially if you do like a component library, build it as if you're the consumer. Think like they would. I hate it when I come across a component that would require a ton of props just to get it to work. Think of what's the minimum number of props that I need to just get this component off the ground and get it to work. And that's really what sort of you should be aiming for in general, what's the minimum. So just some final thoughts. We have a lot of amazing tools in the community, and I don't want to sort of, undermine or undervalue someone else's work. But I think this concept, if we can sort of apply more in our community, in both React community, but also the JS world in general, I think we'll benefit quite a bit, and we'll have much more powerful and stronger, more resilient tools. Again, I don't mean to bash anyone's work, but for instance, if you take, say, Webpack as an example, I use Webpack all the time. It's an amazing tool, but it's heavily dependent on configuration, and that makes it hard to debug. If I think, I don't know if it was Webpack 3 or something, when they added that thing that validates your config, I feel like you're sort of getting to a dangerous territory if you have to sort of validate configs that you're getting in there because they're so complicated. It's hard to debug, it's hard to sort of build on top of. Here in Accordion, we've tried to sort of build our wrappers around Webpack so we can sort of reuse it quickly, but we've found it really difficult because it doesn't scale very well when you build wrappers around it. And I think if you sort of apply composition to these tools and try to avoid configuration as much as possible, I think we will benefit. And I sort of hope that I've at least convinced some of you that that's a good thing to do. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Thank you. It's an interesting talk, and I have some thoughts to share, more than questions, so just to make it more of a discussion. I'd say that you opted, at least in the slides, a lot for higher order components instead of just using classes and so on. It was just because of presentation, because it was a pretty handy example, or you see there is some advantage put in everything as a higher order components that you just turning composing classes in CSS. I understand, for example, in a way it's more testable if you make a component out of everything and it's a bit more maintainable. And this is a thought that I was wondering while I was watching it. Maybe this CSS is a bit more efficient also for the rendering part and so on, but I understand that in terms of testing, yeah, I can see why you would like to have everything parcel and split into smaller components.
When you say class, do you mean, because I mean, React components can be either a function or a class.
No, I mean CSS classes.
Oh, CSS classes.
To get that kind of effect, specifically for this
Right,
one.
right, specifically for styles, essentially.
Yeah. Because somehow I might think that is a kind of over-engineering for an expandable.
Yeah.
You just do your transition with max height or whatever you want to do, and boom, that is done. That way, anyway, is not as testable as it might be with other solutions. So maybe that was your reasoning. Just wondering.
Okay, so I feel like there are a few things there. CSS animations, I don't think, if I'm being honest, they work very well with React. Because they're sort of live outside of React. And specific for Expandable, you can be dealing with many different heights. It's not like one height. And the best sort of animation that I'll be able to achieve is to actually measure that height and use something like React Motion to actually get to that state. Now, obviously, that's more of my opinion. It's less to do, I suppose it's somewhat to do with composition, because with CSS classes, I would find it rather hard to do composition. It's not impossible, probably, but I personally, I think, find it a bit worth it. In fact, once we started doing more and more composition, we've actually sort of, because we traditionally sort of use CSS modules, but we're actually moving towards style components mainly because with CSS, you have to deal with the whole priority order as well, and it doesn't work very well all the time. So that's sort of, I guess, about that one.
Another point is, I see a lot of different expandable, and that in a way, for me, it doesn't make so much sense in terms of user experience. Now, without criticizing the design, because maybe there was some legacy about the choices, do you think it's also the role of the front end to go there and say, look, I'm developing this kind of stuff, which is 5 or 6 different dimensions. Why don't we sit down a moment and we try to do something a bit more orderly, and we try to standardize a bit more? So maybe something that I think it should go hand in hand with all your thought or your reasoning.
Yeah, no, I agree, absolutely. We've been trying to do that with a creative committee for our shared component library that also includes designers. But at the end of the day, there's going to be some differences based on product, based on theme, or branding, and brands are not going to just like die and another brand is born. Things have to live alongside each other. So yeah, we try to do that, but there's always going to be some variation.
Okay. The last point is when you were trying to have all your suggestions, it was mentioned more or less the solid principle of Uncle Bob. If you made, if you
solid principle.
Yeah. If you
it's more like the old line, but I suppose I didn't mention because people get freak out when they hear "oh" these days. But yeah.
Oh, okay, that was it. I was wondering if you think that now using React is even more actual than it was before, because it came out with his suggestion long before React was so popular. But I don't think it was so much widespread. So I think in a way, that is my impression, it was my idea. React brought more an idea of thinking, actually doing everything by components.
Yeah, I mean, I think React is perfect for composition, basically.
Question?
So generally, I would agree that composition is pretty good and makes your code simpler. But what happens quite often is that if you put the responsibility on different users of your component, then it will start to look different. So you have a lot more trouble enforcing consistency in the design. Whereas with one component with a lot of props, that component makes sure that the icon is placed in the same way and that the header looks kind of similar or has a certain style. What's your approach to kind of ensure more consistency across different areas when every user basically has to put their own headers and button placements in place?
Okay, so it's not so much that every user has to put their own header. It's that if they need to change and need to sort of go down a custom route, they can do that. So for instance, with our component library, what we're doing is we have sort of what we call sort of the core. And the core is a set of almost like just functional things. So no specific look and feel. And then that gets used inside theme, and theme adds both styles, but also it adds layout and how things are actually sort of looking next to each other and how they're arranged. Now, when a project comes along and imports this component library, preferably we're using the specific theme and the brand that we've specified. But I don't know about you, but designers aren't always consistent. And a lot of the times they're like, nope, this is different, but this is what I want, and I only want it here, I don't want it to be part of the theme. So we're still going to provide those specific looks and stuff, but it's more about that when that sort of situation comes along, and it does, you have the tools as an engineer to build it without making your life so difficult that you have to either copy and paste things, or worse, make a good component a really bad component by adding more and more parts to it. There's more about that, I think.
Thanks.
Okay.